So there's really only two ways that you can maximize cash on cash return. They are increasing, like cash on cash return. The equation is simply your annual cash flow divided by your entry costs, right? So how much profit you're making each month, right? Times 12 for the year, divided by your entry costs. So it's what it costs to get into the deal, to renovate it, to buy it, the closing costs, any agent commissions, whatever, all those costs. That is the cash on cash return equation. The only way to increase cash on cash return is to increase your cash flow or decrease your entry costs. From my experience, the best strategy to do is to try to increase your cash flow, but you're limited in what you can do depending on the way that you're acquiring the deal. If you're taking on a brand new loan, the only thing you can really do to reduce that debt payment is to pay points up front. You're paying money up front to then reduce your interest rate, which is going to reduce your monthly payments. Is that worth it or not? You have to analyze the deal to determine if paying up front makes it worthwhile to then buy that property at a lower interest rate. If you're doing a subject to transaction where you're taking over someone's existing debt, well, there's really nothing you can do to reduce that debt payment. You're taking over whatever that monthly debt payment is. So you really can't do anything about that. Either it is going to cash flow or it's not going to cash flow with that debt payment. And then for a seller finance or a hybrid where it's seller finance plus subject to, then you have the option to at least try to renegotiate the seller finance portion of it to then decrease one of your biggest expenses, the debt payment. Because like utilities and all that, you can't really reduce that. Like you can say, oh yeah, I'm going from 400 to 200. But in reality, when you have to pay $400, you just screwed yourself and your partners by just faking the numbers. But the debt is one thing you can adjust depending on the way you're acquiring the deal. So to increase cash flow, you can either decrease your expenses, the main one being debt, the main one being seller finance portions of creative transactions, or increase your income, which is implementing a different management strategy. Maybe it doesn't work as a long-term rental, but it works great as a pad split rent by the room or a mid-term rental or a short-term rental. Understanding these three have a little bit more risk, right? Because of different management strategies, you're gonna have to put in more money to be able to rent it out because you're gonna furnish it first and foremost, plus probably renovate it. So these are gonna cost you more money to get into than your long-term rental. So there's ways to increase your income or decrease your expenses to increase your cash flow. If your cash flow is negative, it doesn't matter how low your entry cost is because your cash on cash return will always be negative. Some people who are just buying for tax benefits or a property is negative cash flow, but generates them lots of appreciation or debt pay down, it might make sense for them. But if your goal is financial freedom, you need cash flowing assets almost exclusively. You need positive cash flow because that monthly cash flow is what allows you to be financially free. That is that $20,000 a month coming from my cash flow to cover all of my expenses and leave me enough left over to be able to reinvest into other investments or to lend out to other investors. So to maximize your cash on cash return, maximize your cash flow by increasing your income or decreasing your expenses, or reduce your entry. But if your cash flow is negative, doesn't matter how much you reduce your entry, it's still going to be a negative cash on cash return. If it's positive, lowering the entry could then drive it up. So let me just show you actually. So let's see if this is a hybrid deal. I think it is. So this is a deal right here where it's saying $240,000 purchase price, 10% down payment. There's subject to loan, $185,581. And the monthly payments on that is $843, right? So that comes from the original sub 2 loan. This was their original loan at $200,000 at 3% interest, 30-year term. This is when it started. So the monthly payment for that loan is $843.21. That is what you are taking over here. You're taking over those payments and the remaining amount of debt there. So you're buying at $240, you're paying $24,000 minus the amount of debt you're taking over. This $30,419 can either be paid outright, right, as a down payment up front, or you can finance that from the seller and pay monthly on that. For the seller finance, they're allowing seller financing instead of requiring, this would be $54,419. Like if you had $54,000, there'd be no seller finance loan. Because they're allowing you to only put 10% down, they're going to finance the rest. They're financing it to at 6% interest over a 30-year term. Okay. Your entry costs include the down payment to the seller, right? That 10% we saw. There's an agent involved. There's a minor rehab costs. There is, let me move this. There's minor rehab costs. There's closing costs. There's some admin costs, reimbursement costs that you paid for upfront. So you had to pay for a transaction coordinator. You formed your LLC. You did the inspection. So costs you want to account for and make sure that you can do the lump them as part of your closing costs. I like to separate them because usually when I'm buying a deal and raising money from someone else, these are costs I pay upfront and they need to get paid back at closing from my partner. So I separate that so they understand. And then we're buying it from a wholesaler for a $10,000 assignment fee. We're also raising 3 months of carrying costs or reserves for this property, right? So we have the debt information, we have the entry costs. So let's go back to that pad split model. So in this instance, let's say it's only 2 bedrooms. Let's change this to 1. Let's see if that's all right. So this is not a deal. Okay. So how could we potentially make this a deal? Well, we need to increase the cash flow or decrease the cash on cash return. This one's not a deal because it's making less than $1,000 for the cash flow. So how can we increase that? Well, there's very few ways we can increase that. We're not going to say that this $600 of expenses can be like that still needs to be covered for utilities. We're not going to say, oh, my management's going to cost less or my vacancy is going to be less or my maintenance is going to be less. What we're going to focus on is the debt. That's what we're trying to negotiate. And because we're taking over this $843, you can't change the sub-2 loan. That loan is what it is. You can't tell the bank, I want to pay you less each month. It is what it is. You're kind of like, that's there. All you can do is adjust this 182 payment you're paying on the seller finance loan. But in this instance, even changing this payment to 0, right? Just assuming there's no payments on seller finance loan, I can already tell it's still not going to hit your cash flow goal. So that's a very good way to determine this will still not make sense, even if I paid $0 for cash flow. It's still not getting me the cash on cash or the cash flow I'm looking for. However, you can say, you know what? I'm cool with $888, but that means I need to tell the seller I can only buy this deal, this $30,419. I can't pay you this. I can't pay you a single dollar to make this deal work. What I can do is still accumulate 6% interest and at this $30,000 loan, and I will pay you all of that in 5 years or 10 years. So in 10 years, this $30,419 over 10 years is going to be $55,621 that you're going to pay them in terms of, that's what you're going to pay them in 10 years from now, right? So that's a way to make it work in the short term, but understand in 10 years, you have to pay them that money plus the interest in 10 years. It still doesn't make sense for your cash flow goal in this scenario. So you might just say, you know what? It's not a deal for me. Or you say, hey, you know what? It's close enough. It's close enough. And I'm willing to buy it with this cash flow if I can get this cash on cash return over 15%, right? Because that's really important. If you're raising money, you want to get it at a high enough cash on cash return that when you split it with a partner in you, it still makes sense for both of you guys. So what can you do? Well, you can reduce your cost to build the property or the furnishing costs, but that's not likely. So what you can really do is go into the original entry cost. You can either pay the seller less down. You can negotiate the agent commission. Your rehab cost is your rehab cost. Your closing costs are your closing costs. Your admin costs are your admin costs. So you can either renegotiate the assignment fee, the down payment to the seller, or the agent commission. What I would do is I would look at these 3 and collectively they are $40,000. You can go to the wholesaler, right? If you're going through a wholesaler and say, hey, wholesaler, at $40,000 entry, I can't make this deal work. It does not hit the returns that I'm looking for to make this deal work. And I also, actually, you're also asking them to renegotiate this. This doesn't work at $40,000. Between the $10,000 I'm paying you, the $6,000 for the agent, or the $24,000 for the seller, the only way I can make this work is if we remove this seller finance payment. I will pay them the interest, but in 10 years on a balloon. But I need to either lower their down payment or reduce the agent commissions, or if you're open to it, the assignment fee. But I rarely try to negotiate the assignment fee with the seller. With the wholesaler, I focus more on the agent or the down payment to the seller, because I'm going to probably work with this wholesaler more than once, and I'm asking them to go back and renegotiate these deal terms. The great part is this monthly payment on the seller finance was only $188. That's not really going to change people's lives necessarily. So they might be willing to forego that, especially if you do something like, hey, seller, I can't pay you $24,000 upfront to make this deal work. I can pay you $10,000. And hear me out, all right? So that we drop that $14,000. Now your cash on cash return is 18%. However, because I'm a reasonable buyer and I understand why would you do all these things just for me? You can present this and say, hey, let's go this route. So I'm actually going to replace it right here, this 10,000. So your seller finance is larger, right? You're going to pay them more over time. And you can say, you know what? I'll even add an extra $10,000 to the purchase price. So in 10 years, I'm not only going to give you this $54,000 which is increasing in value at 6%. So that $54,000, I'm going to give you almost $100,000 in 10 years because you worked with me to make this deal work for me as well. So you're making a win situation for you as the buyer and a win situation for the seller as well. You're deferring a lot of this debt payment to maximize your cash flow and your cash on cash return. So you have $888 now, close to your $1,000 goal, and you have a 17.8% cash on cash return, which is a phenomenal cash on cash return. Just understanding that in 10 years, you're either going to have to sell the property or refinance the property to replace all that debt and pay them back that $100,000, right? You're going to need to pay them back that $100,000 for the seller finance loan, or you replace the seller with another loan. Like you can do it. There's a variety of strategies we can get into, just not at this moment. But you're either going to sell it or refinance it or replace the seller some other way, whether it's through your income or whatever it is, or you take out a new loan in second, to replace the seller. So this is a great way of like what I do quite often. If it's sub 2 only, I can't change anything. And if it's hybrid or seller finance, those are the ways that I would renegotiate it to make it a good deal, understanding that my goal is to maximize cash flow first. And then I'm focused on the entry cost as much as possible. Reducing that then allows my cash on cash return to increase, right? And understanding that I'm talking to another human being, I'm talking to various human beings. The agent is probably not going to want to reduce $6,200 of agent commission because that's all they're going to get on this whole deal. The wholesaler is doing all this work for me. They're not going to want less than the $10,000, especially if I'm asking them to renegotiate. But the seller, if I can make it enticing enough, even though I'm paying no monthly payments and I'm paying less upfront, if they're open to that, I can make it worth their while by adding another $10,000 to the purchase price and giving them their interest still, but just all in one balloon. So in 10 years from now, they're going to have over $100,000 to this balloon that they get to. They're going to have $100,000 coming their way in addition to what we're able to solve their problem now if they're open and motivated enough to sell it creatively.